Welcome to AlexGs Aquarium, everybody. Today I want to talk about the 480 gallon reef tank and go over what's been going on in this tank in the last few weeks. There's been a lot of changes, a lot of new additions to this tank I want to talk about, and I really want to focus in on just this tank. I'm going to start splitting up the update videos between the 720 gallon tank and the 480 gallon tank so that I can let everybody see a little bit more of what's going on. I'm going to do the same thing that I did in my last video. I'm going to go ahead, shrink myself down into the corner here. I want to let everybody be able to enjoy this tank while I talk about it. So you're not just looking at me and you can see some of the fish and corals and all the lovely algae that's still growing in the 480 gallon tank. And with that being said, the first topic I want to talk about is the algae in the 480 gallon tank. It is still here. It is definitely in a lot different state than it was from the last update video. A lot of the algae is still dying off, although some of the hair algae has been a little bit more persistent and sticking around in the tank. And I think there's a couple of factors for that. One, it's got a little bit of an established foothold. There's very high intensity light over the tank, which has been helping to feed it, and it has been growing ever so slowly. It hasn't been taken off the way that it was before. There's some patches of diatoms and cyano on the sand bed here and there, but it kind of comes and goes and shifts where it's growing at from day to day. The hair algae on the rocks, a lot of it has really not been growing all that quickly, and I did take the time about a week ago to remove a lot of that algae just using a small diameter piece of vinyl tubing in a 5-gallon bucket to just siphon some of the algae out. Also used a toothbrush to kind of brush it off the rock a little bit, see if I can't remove some of this algae and the nutrients that it's trapping rather than let it kind of fall off the rocks and die, which I think in part has been kind of refeeding the algae in this tank, so it's been kind of staying stagnant. Another measure I did take was I added another light to the 150 gallon refuge tank. I do have the two 6500K floodlights on that tank, but I did have the additional AI Soul that was the light originally over the 480 gallon tank. Since it is a fairly powerful LED, I thought maybe I could take this and just repurpose it, put it into the 150 gallon refuge tank, and put even more light in there to encourage algae growth in that tank. Thus far, the algae in the 150 gallon refuge tank is starting to take off a little bit more. I think I might even take some of the Chaeto, because I only have a small piece of it, move it up higher into the tank and maybe hold it near the surface to see if I can't encourage more growth with more intense light. Overall though, the algae bloom in the 480 gallon tank is slowly losing ground still. I think it's going to be a little bit longer battle than I wanted it to be, but even knowing that, I'm going to slowly ramp up some of the cleanup crew. I added 30 snails to the tank this last week. They were Trocus snails, which do pretty good, other than the wrasses kind of picking on them a little bit, trying to flip them over. They've been doing good. I think a couple more sea urchins, and potentially I'm going to start looking at getting a few more algae eating fish, maybe a lawnmower plenty or some other tanks to start putting into this tank slowly. As for new additions in the 480 gallon, I want to start by talking about fish. Now, I added another 5 royal grommas back to this tank. They are one of my favorite fish that are very peaceful. You can have a small group of them. They have a very interesting dynamic between one another, and these 5 have been doing really good. They actually been getting along a lot better than the previous group I had. They just add a really nice splash of color to the tank visually, and they're very peaceful, so it's a very good fish to consider. If you have a little bit larger tank, you can start getting groups of 3 to 5 or more if you want. They do like to hang out in caves and have a nice rocky area, but they're a great fish, and I gotta have them in my reef tank for sure. So they're back in, and the other additions are all wrasses. I went a little wrasse crazy. I was at my local fish store, Reef Plus. He had a bunch of great looking wrasses in, and in addition to the red cigar wrasse that I already have, the yellow chorus wrasse, and a cleaner wrasse, I went ahead and I picked up a fairy wrasse, Lubbock's wrasse, Melanaris wrasse, which is really got a nice color pattern on it. The camera really doesn't do justice to how nice this Melanaris wrasse is, and it is a really pretty fish. I also picked up a juvenile checkerboard wrasse, and that little checkerboard wrasse, it's going to get a little more size, and kind of like a Melanaris and even the red cigar to a certain point, they could be a little sketchy as to how reef safe they are, as they might pick on some of the creatures such as your crabs, your snails, and maybe even the shrimp. But I understand that, and one benefit I have is that if it does become a problem, that I can move the fish over to the 720-gallon tank and it will do just fine over there. It'll even have a little more swimming room, and I'll ensure that it has a nice tray of sand to go to sleep in at night. The fish have been doing good. They've all been in the tank for a couple of weeks. I've really kind of slowed down how I've been adding fish. I was kind of getting fish every single week before, until I went on vacation and unfortunately kind of had a little die off. And this time around I've taken my time a little bit more, making sure all the fish go through some kind of quarantine period before they go into the display tank. And thus far everybody's been looking good. And I gotta say, I'm just gonna keep taking it slow and steady with adding fish over time, and kind of split up between which tanks get it. The 480-gallon tank has gotten quite a few additions, so the 720 tank will probably get a few additions next. Let's talk a bit about the corals in the tank, how they're doing, and new additions. I'll start off by talking about the SPS corals. The monoporas have been doing okay. The one plating monopora I got with the blue polyps up front hasn't really grown a whole lot. The hair algae that was on those rocks was irritating a little bit more and actually caused a couple little tiny dead spots on the edges of the plate. But it's been coming back nicely, and I think that coral is going to do just fine. Just got to make sure that the algae doesn't really interfere with it. The other monopora I have is doing okay. It's just a branching variety, and it's just been kind of hanging out in a spot and hasn't really grown a whole lot yet. The other 5 acroporas I got are all looking pretty good now, as far as their polyps are all coming out, which is something that wasn't really happening. About a week and a half ago, 2 weeks now, I took the lighting intensity in the 480-gallon tank for the radions and I turned it from 40 to 50%, which is still on the lower side. I'll probably be able to turn them up much higher than that. But one of the reasons I did that, I wanted to push it up a little bit more. I felt that was pretty safe. I don't have my par meter yet, and once I get my par meter, that's when I'm really going to start investigating where my par's at, or all over the tank, and then I'm going to be able to kind of start turning intensities up. But one thing I'm trying to be very careful of is I don't want to put too much light onto my LPS coral, because they have just been doing great. Let's talk a little bit about the LPS coral that are in the tank. So all the bubble corals, the frog spawns are doing good, and in addition to what I had, I've added a little orange wall hammer and orange plate coral. This blastomusa I also added, which my wife just really loved it, and she's like, I just love the color pattern. I was like, alright, we'll take it. I also picked up another variety of a frog spawn, another zoanthid frag, and then one of my favorite corals that I see all the time, and I just think they always look really nice because of their movement and their growth pattern, is a Duncan coral. And I picked that one up just because I always think they're just a great, bread and butter coral to have. They do well. A lot of people say that they work as a good indicator coral, which I have seen too, because they can act funny in certain conditions if they're not happy with water quality. I also added green signularia to the tank. I saw it at the store, and this is another coral that I just really like, green signularia. I probably will put some frags of it into the 720-gallon tank once it gets a little bit bigger. But overall, the corals have been doing good. Now, the one chalice that I have back there has just been growing like a weed. This chalice is put on somewhere between 1/4 and 1/2 inch around its disc. It's already starting to get to the point to where it's going to be touching the rock next to it. and this thing's just been growing like crazy. It's not the most colorful of chalice. I think they call it a Hollywood Stunner. Don't quote me on that name. I'm not good with a lot of those specialty names that everything gets, but overall it's been doing really good and growing like a weed. The acroporas, while they haven't been growing, are still showing their polyps and everything, which is telling me that everything's been doing good coral wise in here. I've been doing a little bit of target feeding. I haven't done a ton of it, but I have been doing it here and there. I've been dosing a little bit of phytoplankton. When I feed the fish, sometimes some pieces will get trapped by the corals and consumed as well. I do like to try and feed the bubble corals on occasion. Unfortunately, the cleaner shrimp have made that a very difficult process, and I will come up with a solution for that in the near future. I just haven't had the time yet to make something to keep them distracted so they don't try to rip the pieces of food out of the mouth of those bubble corals. I also want to talk about the bubble tip anemone, which has been recovering very nicely. Most of the tentacles on this anemone have gotten their color back, and I have been feeding the anemone a couple times a week when I get a chance. The one thing that has been a little difficult though is that the cleaner shrimp also try to take the food from the sea anemone, which is a little more difficult, although I have to say I saw the anemone get the piece of shrimp down almost 15 minutes earlier, and I saw those little shrimp get in there and still rip that piece of food out, which kind of upset me. But again, I will find some way to distract those shrimp so they stop bothering my corals while I try to feed them. It'll just be some kind of DIY project coming up in the near future as soon as I think about what it will be. Overall though, the 480 gallon tank has been doing really good. I've been happy with how the corals are going. Once I get the par meter and start turning up the lighting, I'm going to probably be looking to get a little bit more into SPS once the algae clears up. Really the next big thing I have to do for this system to support the 480 gallon reef especially is get away from manual dosing. I've been going back and forth a long time about what I want to do, what I want to get. I think I've decided which route I want to go with a calcium reactor. I think it's just a matter of making sure it's what I exactly want and ordering it up. I don't want to go with a 2 or 3 part dosing system just because it economically for this size tank does not make a whole lot of sense, because buying 2 parts, 3 parts are very expensive over time compared to a calcium reactor, which has a really high upfront cost, but on the back end has a much lower cost of maintenance. If you like today's update on the 480 gallon tank, please go ahead, hit that thumbs up, let me know that you like the content. If you have comments or questions about the 480 gallon tank or want to see something really specific, go ahead and leave them down below. If you'd like to see more on the 480 gallon reef tank or anything else that I work on with the 1600 gallon system, kind of the ups and downs of keeping this system going, go ahead, hit that subscribe button. Thanks again for watching everybody, and I will see you on the next video.